Picture yourself at 18 years old, draped in a flame-colored bridal veil, believing you're about to step into an evening of joy and ceremony, only to find yourself guided into a chamber crowded with unfamiliar faces, attendants, observers, and a quiet medical practitioner positioned in corner. You had been assured this was simply tradition, an ancient custom passed down through generations, but no one prepared you for what would actually unfold. No one mentioned the physical inspection that awaited you. No one warned you that your body would become a matter of official record. And absolutely no one explained the purpose of the carved wooden object standing in the shadows beneath its heavy covering. An object whose function everyone else in the room already understood perfectly. Within moments, you'll discover why that covering exists. Within moments, you'll understand the reason your mother wept quietly while arranging your hair that morning. Within moments, you'll realize that your wedding night has nothing to do with affection or partnership. It exists for one purpose alone: verification of a transaction. This is not invented drama or historical speculation. This was the reality of matrimony in ancient Rome, a ceremony so profoundly uncomfortable that Roman chroniclers avoided describing it with any directness, and early followers of Christianity worked tirelessly to obliterate every trace of it from collective memory. By the time that cloth is removed, a young woman named Livia will learn the truth behind the ritual that Rome desperately hoped the world would forget, and so will you. The year was 89 of the Common Era. The emperor governed the vast territories with absolute certainty, and 18-year-old Livia Tersa was moments away from discovering that Roman marriage presented two distinct faces to the world. There was the public version, filled with saffron, colored veils, scattered nuts tossed for fertility, and cheerful songs echoing through the streets. And then there was the hidden version, performed behind locked doors in front of individuals who might one day be summoned to repeat every detail before a magistrate in a court of law. What she was about to experience represented a ritual so deeply troubling that ancient historians deliberately avoided describing it with clarity, and one that Christian authors later attempted to erase from historical record entirely. Before we continue deeper into this account, if you find yourself fascinated by the concealed truths of history, the stories that civilizations would prefer remained buried, then subscribe to my channel and leave a like to support this work. And when you reach the moment that disturbs you most profoundly, share in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin our journey into this forgotten chapter of the past. Before this particular evening, before the observers and the cloth-covered object, the day had actually begun with considerable beauty. Her wedding procession through the city had possessed an almost dreamlike quality. Livia wore the traditional flame-colored veil, known as the flammeum, marking her unmistakably to everyone who saw her as a bride crossing the threshold into married life. Her hair had been arranged at dawn according to precise ancestral requirements, parted using a spearhead, and woven into 6 carefully constructed braids secured with woolen ribbons. Every single detail adhered to strict traditional practice passed down through countless generations. At the temple earlier that day, the sacrifice had proceeded without complication. The priest had interpreted favorable omens from the glistening internal organs of the sacrificial sheep. Her father had recited the ancient legal formula that formally transferred her from his authority to her husband's control, and she had spoken the words that generations of brides had whispered before her throughout Roman history. The phrase translated as "Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia," a vow announcing that she no longer possessed independent legal existence. Her new husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a prosperous grain merchant 25 years her senior, had met her only 3 times before that day. Yet by law, the public ceremony had already established her as his legal property, or rather, it had initiated the process. Because in Rome, the ritual performed in public view was merely the beginning of a longer sequence. The truly binding moment the one that made the marriage legally unchallengeable, waited at the end of the torch-lit procession through the city streets, inside a residence she had never entered, surrounded by people she had never agreed to meet. The crowds lining the streets had sung the traditional verses, crude and explicitly sexual in nature, deliberately embarrassing, believed to amuse the gods and ward off malevolent spirits. Young men shouted graphic suggestions through her veil that made Livia's face burn with humiliation. Her mother had assured her the songs were harmless, meant only for protection. But Livia had noticed her mother's trembling hands while fixing her hair that morning. She had seen the tears her mother tried desperately to conceal, and she remembered vividly the final warning whispered urgently into her ear just before she left her childhood home. Do not resist, whatever happens. Whatever they ask of you, do not resist. Resistance only makes everything harder to endure. By the time the procession reached the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus, the last traces of daylight had vanished completely. The doorway had been decorated with wreaths of greenery and wool, with 2 blazing torches marking it as a place where a marriage would be consummated according to ancestral law. The crowd's singing grew louder and more insistent. Someone hurled walnuts at her as a fertility blessing, the shells catching in the elaborate folds of her dress and scraping against her skin. It felt more like mockery than blessing. Marcus waited in the doorway, and behind him, Livia could make out movement in the interior shadows. Too many silhouettes, far more people than she had expected for what she assumed would be a private moment. Tradition required that her husband lift her over the threshold to avoid the bad omen of stumbling upon entry. But the gesture carried deeper meaning, echoing a time when brides did not enter their husbands' homes willingly at all, but were carried in by force. Once the heavy door shut behind her, muffling the songs and shouts outside, Livia finally saw clearly who had been waiting in the entrance hall. There was an elderly woman dressed in ceremonial robes, the Pronuba, whose official duty was to oversee and supervise every moment of the night ahead. A priest of unclear religious affiliation stood nearby. 3 female attendants held basins of water and folded cloths. An older man carried a leather pouch containing medical instruments. And in the corner, partially concealed beneath draped linen fabric, stood a wooden structure nearly 4 feet in height. The Pronuba approached and clasped Livia's hands firmly, her grip tight enough to prevent any possibility of escape or withdrawal. She spoke in formal tones, "Welcome to your husband's house. The sacred rites must now be completed according to law and tradition." Very few people throughout history have spoken honestly about what Roman marriage truly represented. It was not romantic in nature, not sentimental, not a celebration of 2 souls choosing to unite. It was a transaction, a legal transfer of authority, witnessed and documented as carefully as the sale of agricultural land or livestock. Under the oldest Roman legal codes, a wife passed fully and completely into her husband's control, placed in manu, literally meaning in his hand. He held the same legal power over her that he held over his slaves and property, including theoretically the right to judge matters of life and death. By the early imperial era, when Livia walked through that doorway, the laws had softened somewhat on the surface. Women could own certain forms of property under specific circumstances. Divorce had become possible in some situations. Some aspects of paternal power had evolved, but the fundamental foundation remained unchanged. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's legal control to another man's legal control. And like all major transfers of property in Rome, this particular transfer required formal confirmation through established procedures. Consider how Romans handled transactions involving land. Witnesses observed the proceedings. Rituals invoked divine approval for the transfer. Boundaries were physically inspected and walked. Documents were sealed with official marks. Nothing was left to assumption. Everything was verified through established process. Romans applied this exact same logic to marriage with one particularly grim twist. The property being transferred in this transaction was a human body, and that body's ability to produce legitimate heirs represented the asset being purchased and secured. Therefore, Roman law required both the bride's virginity and the physical consummation of the marriage to be verified before the union could be considered legally complete. Not rumored, not assumed, but verified through direct observation and documentation. And the rituals designed to achieve that verification, the procedures Livia was about to face, were ones that very few ancient writers dared to describe with any directness. Because, even in Rome, a civilization not known for excessive modesty, these particular rituals were considered unspeakably intimate. Livia stood trembling beside the shrouded wooden figure, completely unaware that what happened next would be burned into her memory for the remainder of her life. A ritual so profoundly disturbing that later generations would try desperately to pretend it had never existed at all. Roman law was uncomfortably explicit on one particular point. A marriage did not exist legally or socially until the union was physically completed, and it was not sufficient for the husband and wife to simply claim it had happened. There had to be confirmation, observation, and sworn testimony from reliable witnesses. Without witnesses present, the entire marriage could be challenged in court. Without verification of the bride's virginity, the legitimacy of future children could be questioned by rival family members or political enemies. For Rome, that kind of uncertainty was completely unacceptable. So the Romans created rituals, procedures that fit perfectly within their legal world, but feel disturbingly unimaginable to modern sensibilities. The Prenube tightened her grip on Livia's arm and guided her toward the veiled structure standing in the corner. Livia's heart hammered so violently she could feel its rhythm pulsing in her throat. She sensed instinctively that whatever stood beneath that cloth would fundamentally change everything about her understanding of her life, her body, her beliefs about the world. But there was no path backward now, no door through which she could retreat. The Prenube murmured in steady tones, her fingers firm against Livia's arm. "You must greet Mutinus Tutinus. You must seek his blessing before your husband may approach. The gods must witness your submission to ensure fertility." Livia swallowed hard, her breath coming in trembling gasps. She had never heard of this deity before, and she had absolutely no idea what greeting him truly meant in practical terms. Her hands shook visibly as she reached for the draped fabric. The witnesses leaned closer with visible interest. Even the attendants stopped their movements. The entire room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. When Livia pulled the cloth away, she understood immediately why. Standing beneath the covering was a wooden figure carved with uncomfortable anatomical accuracy into the shape of an exaggerated male form. But it was not a tiny charm like the protective pendants children wore around their necks for luck. It was not a crude decorative figure placed in gardens to ward off intruders and evil spirits. It was deliberate, intentionally proportioned to adult scale, built for one specific purpose. And that purpose became terrifyingly clear the moment the Prenube began to explain what was required. Mutinus Tutinus was Rome's shadowy deity, associated with initiation and fertility. Ancient authors mention him only briefly in their writings, and always with a palpable sense of embarrassment, as if the very name felt indecent to speak aloud. Augustine, writing centuries later, as Christianity tightened its grip on the Roman world, described the ritual with fury and profound disgust. He stated that Roman brides were required to sit upon the god's representation before lying with their husbands, and they did so in full view of witnesses. He condemned the practice in the strongest terms, but he did not invent the description. Other early Christian writers referenced the same rite, often hinting that it was too shameful to describe openly in written text. Arnobius claimed brides were made to straddle the symbol, while their new spouses watched the proceedings. Lactantius argued that even speaking of the ritual polluted the tongue of the speaker. Even Varro, a pagan scholar writing centuries earlier, mentioned brides being presented to Mutinus Tutinus with phrasing that suggested direct physical contact, though he carefully avoided providing specific detail. Modern historians, understandably uncomfortable with the implications, have often attempted to downplay these descriptions, suggesting perhaps that brides only sat lightly on the statue's lap in some purely symbolic gesture that carried no physical element. But the ancient language preserved in these texts does not support this softer interpretation. Augustine used specific Latin terminology meaning to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius's phrasing clearly suggested penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details at all, which seems unlikely if the act had been merely a symbolic touch requiring no direct contact. The official explanation offered to participants, of course, was fertility and divine blessing. The unspoken purpose might have been something else entirely: to break down psychological resistance, to demonstrate absolute submission before witnesses, to prepare a virgin bride physically and mentally for what the law required next. Livia stood frozen before the wooden deity, the flickering lamplight throwing its grotesque silhouette large across the wall behind it. The pronuba moved behind her, adjusting her posture with firm hands, arranging her body, guiding her without gentleness or concern for her comfort. The witnesses watched in absolute silence, their faces impassive. Her husband watched from his position near the doorway. The physician waited behind them all, hands clasped, prepared for what came next in the sequence. And in that moment, Livia finally understood the meaning of her mother's trembling warning, the obscene songs sung in the streets, the secrecy surrounding these traditions, the dread she had sensed all day. She understood what being a Roman wife would truly demand of her. Technically, she could refuse. The law did not permit anyone to physically force her, but refusal meant the marriage contract would immediately collapse. She would be returned to her father's home, not as an honorable bride who had simply changed her mind, but as a discarded woman, damaged goods, untouchable, unmarriageable. She would bring disgrace upon her entire family. She would become a source of shame whispered about at dinner tables throughout the city. Her life, as she had known it and imagined it, would be completely over. So she did not refuse. When the ritual finally ended, attendants approached with warmed, scented water. They washed her carefully, murmuring prayers intended to purify her after her contact with the deity. But the cleansing served a second purpose, a more practical one. It prepared her body for the examination that followed. The physician, who had been watching silently throughout, now stepped forward with his leather pouch, and Livia felt her stomach drop with fresh dread. This part was not optional either. In marriages involving substantial wealth, important lineage, or political standing, Roman brides underwent medical verification before the ceremony. A midwife or physician documented the bride's virginity in official records. The documentation from that examination could later be presented in legal disputes about inheritance or legitimacy of children. The texts preserved by Roman medical writers, cruel in their clinical precision, leave absolutely no doubt about what the examination involved in practical terms. That first examination, conducted earlier in the day or sometimes days before, established the starting point. It declared Livia untouched, an asset unaltered, as Roman law conceptualized it. Now came the second examination. This one verified that the ritual with Mutinus Tutinus had been carried out properly, that the physical evidence matched the earlier documentation, that she was, according to Roman logic, appropriately prepared. Everything occurred with the witnesses remaining present in the room. Their statements could later be demanded in court if the marriage was ever challenged by rival families or political enemies. and not one person in that chamber seemed to feel the slightest discomfort about what was being done to her. Modern readers instinctively recoil at these descriptions. What feels invasive, humiliating, and traumatic to us was to Romans simply a matter of standard legal procedure. The bride's comfort did not factor into the equation at any point. Her emotions were as irrelevant as the feelings of a field being surveyed before sale. Property did not have feelings that mattered. Property was transferred according to established process, and the procedures had to be followed precisely. When the examination was finally complete, the prenupal led Livia toward the bedchamber that had been prepared for the consummation. The room was arranged exactly as tradition required. The bed was positioned so that it could be easily observed from the doorway, because that doorway, by ancient custom, would remain open throughout the night ahead. Oil lamps burned steadily, casting enough light for the prenuba to observe without interruption. Attendants waited nearby to assist afterward with the final documentation. Every part of the room felt staged, arranged, prepared for a ritual Livia could not escape. Marcus entered at last. He paused at the doorway, glanced toward the watching prenuba for acknowledgement, and stepped toward the bed. His face betrayed something Livia did not expect to see. Not confidence, not desire, but visible unease. As if even he understood that what was about to happen was not an act of intimacy or affection. It was an act of verification for legal purposes, and the night was only beginning. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, and that alone startled Livia. She had expected a man who was confident, assured, even dominant, someone who knew exactly what this night demanded and how to proceed. Instead, he glanced quickly toward the prenuba, as if seeking approval or permission before approaching. A faint flush of embarrassment crossed his face before he moved toward the bed. The prenuba lifted her chin, her voice formal and heavy with ritual authority that filled the chamber. The bride is made ready according to tradition. The gods have witnessed her submission. Let the union be completed according to the customs of our ancestors. Let those present affirm the act. Let no doubt remain that this woman has become a wife in law and fact. Her tone left absolutely no room for hesitation or delay. What followed unfolded slowly, hour by hour, under the unblinking observation of those assigned to witness. The prenuba stood watch from the doorway, stepping forward only when tradition required instruction, occasionally adjusting something, occasionally correcting Livia's posture or Marcus's approach, ensuring that every part of the consummation aligned with legal expectation and could be properly documented. The door remained open throughout. Lamplight spilled into the corridor beyond. Anyone in the household could hear the movements, the voices, the ritual commands given by the prenuba. Every sound was part of the documentation, part of the evidence that would establish the marriage as legally valid. Nothing about that night was private. Nothing was meant to be. For Livia, the bed linens might as well have been parchment, and her body the ink Rome demanded to finalize the contract. Everything that happened served as a form of verification, one final step to make the transfer of authority completely unchallengeable in any future legal proceeding. By dawn, the air in the chamber felt heavy and stale. The lamps had burned low, and the physician returned to the room. He stepped inside with the same clinical detachment he had shown during the earlier examinations. His task was straightforward: confirm that consummation had occurred according to requirements, and that Livia now bore the physical evidence expected of a woman who had crossed from virgin to wife. His examination was recorded in official documentation. The prenuba gave her sworn testimony that would be preserved. Witnesses nodded in formal acknowledgement of what they had observed. The legal transformation was complete. Livia Tersa, barely 18 years old, was now officially a Roman wife in every legal sense. Her role, her identity, her entire future had all been fundamentally reshaped within a single night. She would go on to bear children over the next decade. She would oversee her husband's household, host elaborate dinners for his business associates and political connections, manage household attendance, perform required religious duties, and carry herself with the composure and dignity expected of a respectable matron. To the outside world, she would appear dignified, capable, entirely respectable. But about her wedding night, she would speak to absolutely no one, not even her own daughters when they eventually approached marriageable age. There were no words adequate for it, and in truth, she had never heard another woman speak openly of their own experience either. Livia's silence was not unusual or exceptional. It was universal among women of her class. Women of her world did not record these experiences in personal writings. Men did not document them in any personal detail. The rituals were so deeply embedded into the fundamental structure of marital life that describing them would have seemed unnecessary, like explaining the existence of daylight or the necessity of breathing. Everyone already knew what happened, and yet no one spoke of it openly. That is precisely why historians today struggle to reconstruct with certainty what truly happened behind closed doors in ancient households. Much of what we know comes from fragments scattered across different sources. Angry denunciations by Christian writers who considered the practices obscene. Shreds of legal commentary preserved in dusty manuscripts. Offhand references in medical treatises. Archaeological discoveries whose meaning becomes clear only when placed beside these scattered textual references. The absence of detailed first-hand accounts is not evidence of conspiracy or deliberate concealment. It is evidence of familiarity. The rituals represented the water that Roman women swam in, so omnipresent and ordinary within their context that describing them felt pointless to those who lived through them. For nearly 1,000 years, this was the reality of marriage in Rome. Generations of brides walked the same lit paths through city streets. Generations of mothers whispered the same warnings to their daughters. Generations of young women endured the same night, the same witnesses, the same scrutiny and verification. The system endured across centuries because everyone, men, women, families, priests, accepted its fundamental logic. Property had to be verified before transfer. Legal transactions required witnesses. Marriage produced legitimate heirs, and therefore needed proof of consummation. Women were the conduit through which family lines continued and property passed. It made perfect sense within its own internal logic, even as it feels monstrous to modern understanding. The end of these practices did not come from Rome deciding collectively that it had gone too far, that the system had become inhumane. It came from outside, from the gradual spread of Christianity and the transformation of Roman values that occurred across the 4th and 5th centuries. With new theology came fundamentally new assumptions about human nature and dignity. If women possessed souls equal in value to men's souls, they could not be treated merely as property to be transferred. If marriage was a sacred sacrament blessed by God, it could not include rituals that the Church deemed obscene. If modesty was a virtue to be cultivated, then the presence of witnesses during consummation became intolerable. The shift was not instant. It was not easy. It was not complete or uniform across all regions. But gradually, across cities and among elite households first, the old ceremonies were abandoned or reshaped beyond recognition. And with them went much of the evidence. Statues of Mutinus Tutinus were systematically smashed or buried. Texts referencing the wedding night, rituals in detail, were quietly removed from libraries or simply left to decay into illegibility. Wall paintings that hinted at the rites were plastered over with new Christian imagery. The pronuba's duty shrank from active supervisor of consummation to merely a symbolic attendant at the ceremony. Within a few generations, the full knowledge of what Roman weddings had once required vanished almost completely. Remembered only dimly in obscure manuscripts read by curious scholars many centuries later. The Christians who reshaped Rome were not merely scrubbing away embarrassing historical details. They were consciously forging a new civilization atop the ruins of the old, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge what those ruins had once supported. They succeeded almost completely in erasing these practices from collective memory. Today, most people imagine Roman marriage as consisting of saffron, colored veils, festive songs, and scattered walnuts tossed for luck. A charming blend of ritual and romance. But fragments survive despite everything. Fragments always survive if you know where to look. Livia Tersa died around 130, one of the Common Era, roughly 60 years old. She had been a wife for more than 4 decades. She had raised multiple children to adulthood. She had fulfilled every expectation Roman society placed upon her. But what did she remember when she thought back to her wedding night in private moments? Did she relive the fear, the shame, the complete powerlessness? Did she make some kind of peace with it over the decades? Did she hope desperately that her own daughters would endure something milder, that customs might soften? Or did she simply accept it as unchangeable, the way things were and always would be? We cannot know with certainty. She left no written record of her inner thoughts. Roman women of her social standing were not expected to leave such records. The silence surrounding these rituals comes directly from women whose experiences were never considered important enough to preserve for history, whose bodies were absolutely central to Roman legal systems, yet whose thoughts and feelings were completely irrelevant to the histories that men wrote. We know in considerable detail what was done to them. We rarely know what they actually felt about it. Yet we know enough from the fragments that survive to understand why generations of later Romans tried so desperately hard to erase this particular aspect of their civilization's history. Rome is often idealized in modern culture as the foundation of Western law, order, and civilization itself. But acknowledging honestly what Rome demanded of its women significantly complicates that idealized story. It demonstrates clearly that brutality and cultural refinement can coexist within the same society, that legal sophistication can operate alongside systematic dehumanization, that a civilization can build magnificent structures and develop complex philosophy while treating half its population as transferable property. The rituals described here are gone, abolished centuries ago. But the women who endured them were real human beings. For Livia, for her mother, for her daughters, for countless unnamed brides whose wedding nights were rituals of control, scrutiny, and legal verification rather than celebrations of love, they lived. They endured, and they were systematically silenced by the society that used them. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as shocking entertainment, but as testimony to what happens when law and custom treat human beings as property to be documented and transferred. If this account has affected you, if it has made you think about the foundations of the societies we inherit and the assumptions we make about progress, then perhaps these long silenced voices have finally been heard across the centuries. Subscribe to my channel for more hidden histories that challenge what we think we know about the past. And share in the comments where you're watching from and what aspect of this story struck you most powerfully.